My name is Felicia Mburu, and I am proud to be an Atlantic Fellow from the 2023 cohort. My interest in the fellowship actually started from my own personal experience that I would like to call Wairigia Speaks. One of my favorite authors is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote a book called The Perfect Nine. It's the origin story of the Agikuyu people of Kenya, where I am from, and also so happens to be my community. But in the book, The Perfect Nine talks about the 9 daughters of Gikuyu and Mumbi, but does not speak about the 10th daughter, whose name is Wairigia. Wairigia was born a cripple, and that's in the book. It's a mythical book because Wairigia is the only one who speaks in one voice. All the other 9 daughters have to speak as one instead of 9. And therefore, this brings my story to the fore. Being a person who's neurodivergent on the spectrum is quite interesting, and especially when it comes to maternal health. My daughter, who is equally on the spectrum, has 2 birthdays. And the fun story behind it is that when I went into labor, no one really told me anything because there's a serious lack of information about how we who are neurodivergent process information. Neurodivergence has nothing to do with your brain. It's just how you process information. It's in a different way, a more colorful way. And therefore, I remember when it was her time to come, I was scheduled for a cesarean section. And my daughter decided she's not coming. She will come when she wants. And therefore, she put me into labor instead of the scheduled C-section. And what happened was, I remember during the whole process, I had to endure 10 hours of labor, and no one had prepared me for this. And at some point, my labor decided to just go off. There was no more labor. And then they were like, okay, unfortunately, we have to induce you now. And I asked, what are we going to do about that? How does the induction happen? And they're like, don't worry, the doctor knows. And so I kept quiet and waited for the induction. But my daughter, even after dilating, decided she was not interested in coming. And therefore, we had to now go into the emergency situation. And I remember during this whole process, I'm experiencing some form of labor which is not labor. I'm expecting to go into a C-section and no one is giving me information. There's so much going on in the labor room. And in the process, there's a young man asking me, so what is the birth date of your daughter? Please sign here. I'm like, wait a minute, what am I signing? There's too much going on. All my senses were going haywire. And I'm supposed to make decisions in all this chaos. And that is how my daughter ended up with 2 birthdays. And she never lets us forget. So we have 2 cakes every December. That said, it brings into fore the challenges that us women with disabilities go through. One of the things that comes across is that there is a completely no information because of the legal and attitudinal barriers about what it means to be a person on the neurodivergent spectrum. People assume that you do not know what you're saying. They assume that you do not exist. So when I started my work with AFHE, originally I thought it was about access to health, but turns out it was actually about how invisible we are. Some of the things that make us invisible include the idea of lack of information. As I've shared my experience, which I had to make peace with, was that the information was coming to me all at once, and all my senses were heightened at that moment. Yet I'm expected to make a decision in the middle of the chaos that was going on, in addition to the idea that my mind is already chaotic. There's the children born with disabilities. One of my biggest fear was that no one was giving me information about whether my daughter would end up with a disability just like me, no matter how many times I asked. And while still in Kenya, children born with disabilities do not get diagnosed until the age of 6. It is the legal requirement. Yet it was clear that my daughter was more than 50% chance of being born with a disability just like me. There's the assumptions, because we realize that in maternal healthcare services, how data and the system is designed, is collected for neurotypical women. And yet we know that is another stereotype. Not all persons are women. Not all birth persons will be women. And there are certain modifications we have to put in place to ensure that all birth persons can be able to participate in maternal health services, irrespective of their challenges. We need to modify how our beds look. We need to modify how information is delivered. Next to me, while I was going through all of this, I came to realize there was a refugee girl of Somali origin who was also going through the birthing process. And she could not speak or understand the language. And because she was not Kenyan, she was not covered by insurance, and unfortunately had gone through FGM procedures. Equally, like me, information was being bombarded onto her, and that's how she ended up going for a C-section as well. This reminds me of further experiences that could have been used to modify for how we give information. A client of mine who is deaf-blind, unfortunately during COVID, got raped and got pregnant from the experience. And what happened was, no one actually gave her, because no one could speak tactile sign language to her during her prenatal process or during the birthing process. She ended up having to have an emergency hysterectomy, all because she could not access information on what it means to be pregnant. But if we look at this, it is an opportunity for us to learn that if we design maternal health services from a disability perspective, we end up including all birth persons in the process. It is easier to approach how service delivery and inclusion when we make disability visible. And we're not just making disability visible, we're making all women visible in the process. In Kenya, we have a maternal mortality rate of 362 per 100,000 births, which is high, but for us to look at it as a good thing in the sense that it has gone much lower over the last 10 years. But when we look at this statistic, I do not see us, women with disabilities, in the conversation. I equally do not see children with disabilities in the conversation. When we talk about maternal health services, there is absolutely no information on what the risks associated with being a woman or a birth person giving birth to children. We all celebrate the birth of a child, but do we understand the risks that come with it? Do we give enough information on the disability aspects that comes with the pregnancy and birthing process? And in this conversation, I'm not leaving out the women who are trying to get pregnant but cannot. It is still part of the maternal health services that are not provided. And the lack of data and information gap becomes very clear. So while I was going through all of this, my idea was, I thought that it was about legal and attitudinal barriers. Turns out AFHE, the Atlantic Fellowships for Health Equity, changed my perspective. It was about leadership and giving a voice to those who are invisible in accessing healthcare services. As a person who's used to being quiet, being silenced, not being looked at as a leader, and I love my invisibility cloak, it meant that someone had to take leadership. And that's what gave me the idea to actually apply for the Atlantic Fellowships. I thought I was coming to give a voice to health equity. It turns out I was coming to learn about me and how to be a leader myself, how to find my voice and finally be the Wairigia that Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about. Acceptance of myself as a person with neurodiversity and as a leader was the biggest challenge that I appreciate the Atlantic Fellowship for Health Equity for giving me that confidence back. In addition, I learned about the snowflake model of leadership and how leadership doesn't have to be about me. It is about the other people that I coach, that I give a voice to as well. I was not alone in that birthing chamber. There were several of us with one common thing. We were just invisible in the system. And how can I use the snowflake model of leadership to ensure that everybody gets a voice? How to uncenter myself and center the community in the work that I do. And therefore, moving forward into the future, what am I looking into? I encourage all of us to see the invisible, because we all exist in this ecosystem. But if you realize that if you design things from an invisibility perspective, from the ones who are not seen by the healthcare systems that we all exist in, you will be able to design a healthcare system that is inclusive for all persons. In the words of Thomas Sankara, one of my other favorite feminists in this world, you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, and the courage to invent the future. Besides, it took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen. And I invite all of you to join me in our madness.